Thanks, Kimberly, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. I'm very excited to introduce the latest webinar in our series of research on research integrity. I'm sure I don't have to tell most of you about the current crisis in research integrity, the lack of trust in science and research, the issue of academic misconduct, paper mills, etc. So we've run a series of webinars with folks who are working on solutions in this area. And I'm particularly excited today to introduce Hilke and Richard from STM Solutions. STM is the Association of Science, Technology and Medical Publishers. And they recently published a report in March, which sets out a framework for researcher identity validation, which is a topic which often comes up in these discussions about research integrity. One of the chief means of perpetuating a particular fraud appears to be through misrepresentation of identity. And this turns out to be quite a complex topic with quite some nuance about the best way to validate identity while making sure that researcher privacy is preserved or appropriately treated and not introducing any biases into the system. So Hilke is the Chief Information Officer for STM Solutions, which is STM's operational arm, which develops and manages shared infrastructures and collaborative services to support the scholarly communications community. He's responsible for the STM Integrity Hub and serves as Program Director for GetFTR and Seamless Access. Before joining STM, Hilke worked in several senior technology and product management roles in both private and public sector organizations supporting the research community. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics from the University of Amsterdam. Richard is a product consultant specializing in identity and privacy. He draws on 20 years experience as a developer and product manager to help organizations have simple, consistent and trusted relationships with their users. He's worked at product director for identity and access at Elsevier, as a service owner, product manager and principal web developer at the BBC. He has a background in science communication and a degree in biology from the University of Edinburgh. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Richard, who will run us through the presentation.
Thanks very much, Chris. I will just press the share button and bring up my deck. There we go. Okay. So hello, everyone. I am just going to dive straight in. We are here to talk about an important and interesting subject, but I just want to get briefly philosophical and explain why I think it's so important before we connect the dots to the real subject of this talk and what we've been doing. Research integrity is, as Chris mentioned, the title of plenty of articles and conference presentations these days. And it sounds like, it sounds like motherhood and apple pie, like a bit of a no-brainer. Integrity is a good thing. So everybody wants integrity. But I want to unpack this a little bit to say a little bit more about why it matters so much and in what ways. Research is a collective thing. It's the structured sharing of knowledge, and it depends on communication, on sharing ideas and sharing results and questions and so on. It's about working on the basis of what's been done before. And so communication is, in the end, what science publishing is all about, regardless of the sort of other layers and mechanisms that evolve around it. But for this fundamental thing to work, this natural thing of communication to work, there has to be some kind of trust, not blind trust, but the kind of human trust, rational trust that lets us rely on what other people say, at least enough to be able to do that testing and challenging and to build on it. There has to be an assumed frame of reference with some kind of trust, so that you know that what you're reading and what you're consuming isn't arbitrary or deceptive even. In evolutionary biology and game theory and that kind of thing, this is pretty well understood. Communication depends on honest signals. If signals can be faked without any cost to the faker, then those signals stop conveying information and just become noise. And so the whole system breaks down. And so you need mechanisms, something that makes honesty detectable and balances out dishonesty. The motto of the Royal Society, which is in Latin, is nullius in verba, which translates to on the word of no one, or take nobody's word for it. And that sounds kind of like the rejection of trust in a way, but it's not. It's actually the opposite. It's the recognition that trust in science isn't blind and automatic. It's about verifiability. What it's telling us to do, and what we mustn't do, is we mustn't accept things just because someone says that they're true. We accept them because we can check them and we can replicate them and examine the foundations. This is what makes trust a rational thing in scientific context, and it's what makes science science. But if there's a realistic possibility of cheating, and part of that is people being able to misrepresent who they are or make false contributions and hide behind claims about themselves or their work that are fake, then the whole system breaks down. We would no longer be talking about the ideas and the results and the work of science. We'd be spending all the time trying to work out what's true and what's false. Rather, whether the research even existed in the first place, rather than its conclusions. So to put it bluntly, that's a bad thing. Without trust and the ability to communicate, there's no confidence in research, and it stops the process of science from working. So in research, and in many other areas of human life, in the real world or the digital world, identity is a really important part. It's hard to trust a claim without knowing who made it or knowing what entity it's tied to, because the fabric of trust is made up of these connections. Identity is something that gives accountability, which is what makes communication meaningful. It needs to be strong enough to establish a kind of continuity, so you can say, yes, this person made this claim and they've acted consistently over time. And then I suppose that's what ORCID is all about. So when we talk about research integrity, and this subject I'm coming on to, research identity verification, we're not talking about it for the sake of it. We're talking about doing just enough to preserve the basic conditions under which science can happen, which I think we probably all agree is a reasonably important thing to communicate about. So this is why we've been doing this work on researcher identity verification, which, if you want a catchy name, can be abbreviated to RIVER, but I'll leave that to you. We have spent well over a year working on this, and have produced these two reports, which I'd encourage you to look at if you haven't already. The first is a kind of background to the whole subject, and the second one is introducing this framework and some recommendations. But they're all for review by all of you and by the community at large. This isn't the end of a process. This is the process. So the the result of discussions in a working group drawn from a range of people from various publishers and editorial systems. But, and this is important to say, we're working to get opinions from the whole world of academic publishing, and that's why I'm here. So, what am I going to talk about? Broadly, I'm going to take us through the problem, and then I'm going to introduce the framework that we've been working on to try to address that problem. Then I will highlight the main recommendations that we've worked out from the report, and then I'll talk about some of the challenges, of which there are many, and the work that we're doing to try to make progress on those challenges. So, what's the problem? Well, research fraud is increasingly common. There are many papers published out there, not fraudulent ones, I hope, that have documented thousands of retractions due to fake papers making their way into the academic literature. There are many motivations for this fraud, and that's a subject of a different presentation. Yeah, as I've said, this has some pretty negative consequences. The next point is that fraud is very often based on identity manipulation. Lots of people act dishonestly in other ways, plagiarism, falsifying their results under their own names, for example. But the growth of paper mills, which are large-scale efforts to sell fake authorships and get papers into journals of various kinds under false pretenses, is fundamentally built on identity manipulation, which is often combined with fabricating the data and fake images and other things. But really, we're talking about networks of fake reviewers with fake affiliations, sometimes hijacking real researchers' identities, and so on. As part of our work, we did some surveys into this, and most people working in this area are familiar to a fairly major extent with these kinds of tactics. The thing is, identity manipulation is relatively easy to do because there's little or no verification, and the scale of the problem makes it hard to keep up. There's so much research going out that it's an arms race, and it's not a particularly balanced arms race. And this is because verification is relatively hard. There is justified reluctance to put barriers in the way and to risk making life more difficult for legitimate researchers or excluding them completely. So that's the problem overall. But what is identity verification? What are we really talking about here? I thought we could take a really quick step back, and I'll use an example that I dreamt up to illustrate. Imagine you're driving your car. You are operating a machine that is powerful and useful, but it has consequences if it's misused. So this is the reason why we let, the reason why we let cars onto motorways and public roads is because there is a system of accountability. License plates. License plates don't reveal your personal identity to everyone, but they do allow other parts of the system of society to hold people responsible for their actions when it matters. And it's an example of a system of trust that is scaling up into sort of society level. And the system only works if those plates can be verified. If anyone could draw their own number plate on in felt tip pen or copy someone else's, the whole thing would collapse, right? You wouldn't be able to do anything about dangerous drivers. You couldn't enforce any rules. Everyone would be on the road doing risky things with no practical way to tell who was accountable or to have any kind of deterrence. Obviously, that's not the entire story of license plates, and there's plenty of problems in the world of license plates as it happens, but it shows that there are some parallels in the real world. Now, unfortunately, fake license plates or self-claimed license plates is kind of how large parts of the academic publishing system currently work. We've got researchers submitting papers, sometimes under false names with fake affiliations or email addresses like, richard@gmail.com, which is perfectly fine in most circumstances, but we've got no reliable way of telling who someone really is or whether they're even a real person or a real researcher. It's the academic equivalent of a felt tip license plate. Now, I could keep going with this metaphor and have a separate conversation about the academic equivalent of a speed camera, but we'll get back to the editorial process. Let's walk through a couple of simple scenarios. One is with an honest person and the other person isn't going to be so honest. The first one signs in as they would today with a personal email address, and they submit some real work, and they list their genuine co-authors, and they're asked to suggest some reviewers. Those reviewers are invited to take part in peer review, and they also sign in with their personal email address, and they submit their peer review, and the paper is published. It's a simplification, but it's basically the shape of the system, right? The problem is that this can be subverted, and it regularly is. The dishonest researcher submits their paper, but then submits fake reviewers and a list of fake co-authors. And the thing is that these are all identities under their control. So this means that they can review their own paper, and unsurprisingly, it goes through and gets published. And then if it's detected by a speed camera, then it gets retracted, which is all very costly and wasteful and damaging, but it works. So how might we solve this? And the answer that we've come up with, which is reasonably obvious but important to go into the detail of, is verification. But the big question is, how can we do this right? So what we thought was we need to step back and think about what some of the principles of our approach should be. Excuse me, the report does go into this in quite a lot of detail, but in summary, we need to make sure that verification doesn't exclude people, because it's something as I'll explain could do. We need to make sure that it's proportional. It's not asking for more information or requiring more effort than is necessary for the context. Related to this, we need to make sure that it's minimizing data collection and handling it properly. The whole process has to be physically possible to implement, and has to actually be effective in real life. And it has to work as part of a larger system, making it possible to set up accountability loops, a bit like the driver license example. And this is where the framework comes in. It's an effort to describe a way to introduce identity verification in line with the principles. There are 5 parts, which I'll just go through. The first is assessment, which is about the journal itself, the specific context where the verification is happening, deciding what's proportionate in each case. And that's basically a risk assessment. Then there's the verification itself, and this is about getting information from the user. Then there's evaluation, which is about working out what this information means in terms of trust. Then there's deciding about whether or not that trust is enough based on the assessment at the beginning. And then finally, some kind of feedback loop, which is about making sure that we're learning and adapting as we go along, because this is a bit more of an evolutionary process rather than a silver bullet. But let's go through each of these boxes, starting with the first one. Not all actions in the real world present the same level of risk. Getting money out of a cash machine requires a PIN number and a card, which is less effort than boarding an airplane, because that's a riskier action. So you have to go through more, you have to have a passport, you have to go through scanning and so on, right? And this in turn is less effort and less risky than launching the nuclear missiles, we would hope. So that would require a lot more security and a lot more verification. So likewise, in academic systems, there are different levels of risk. And this depends on lots of things, including what the user is trying to do. An author has less decision-making power and consequences than a reviewer, who has less than a guest editor. So you might expect more verification to be needed in each case. There are lots of other factors, like how much fraud an individual journal is experiencing, how much risk is tolerated or is appropriate for that journal. And this is an individual decision case by case. So it's really important to stress that what we're saying in this framework is that this assessment step, the question of how much trust is needed, is a decision for the journal itself, for the editor, the owner of the system. It's a judgment for them to make, and that's how this framework works. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. The next question is about verification itself. Verification is about getting just the right level of information from users to meet the threshold of trust from the first step. But what information do we want? So here we've broken things. There's lots of different ways of looking at this, but we've broken this down into two kind of dimensions, two axes. Evidence of individual identity and evidence and confidence that we have in the person's background, in their academic credibility. If we've got little evidence of either, which is what a personal email address gives us, then we've got no basis for trust. If someone provides lots of self-made claims about their work, then this is also not quite enough to provide trust. If we can verify their individual identity more, then we've got a route to accountability, but we don't have much evidence that they're a genuine researcher. So this is better, but it's not the best we can get. If we can get a combination of both, verified evidence about them and about their work, then we've got a way to trust them more. So the framework goes through like a menu of different verification methods, different options. Each has got trade-offs, and different users will have different abilities to use each of them, which is a really important point. So there's, if we take these personal email addresses, I've called them opaque email addresses, but they're non-institutional email addresses, things that don't come with any guarantee of information of where they're from. They, as we know, don't give us any trust. ORCID without external verification in the form of trust markers is better, but it's still potentially open to manipulation, even if there are good feedback loops to help to reduce that, which is why trust markers were invented, I guess, which is we can come on to in just a second. Institutional identity via federated identity infrastructure or email confirmation gives us more trust. and I guess I'm simplifying here, but it gives us evidence of who they are and also that they have an affiliation, which is information about their academic credibility. ORCID with trust markers, which are the claims made in your ORCID record that are verified by external trusted organizations rather than just you, are even better. But there's a whole spectrum inside that, which I won't go into right now. In the absence of any of these options, a user could fall back on an official document like a passport, which is what you would use if you were trying to use Airbnb, or if you wanted to verify your account on LinkedIn, and so on. So we're not talking about publishers handling passports and driver's licenses. This is about using the same services that Airbnb or whatever would be using, those third-party things. And then finally, we need an ultimate fallback where the user directly contacts the journal to works with the journal to arrange a Zoom call or something, and does the kind of manual checks that you'd use today if you needed to. So there are other options too that we could talk about, like vouching, where somebody else, like a senior research supervisor, might be linked to somebody like an early career researcher. But that's something that we're exploring, and it's potentially a bit more complicated. But the main point is that there has to be a range of options to make sure that nobody is excluded. And the other key point is that none of these things is a brand new invention. We're working off systems that already exist, or in the case of trust markers, whether that's through ORCID or an equivalent to ORCID, they would be encouraged more and built upon, but they already exist. We're not reinventing any wheels here. So we then have verification slowing down or stopping people from submitting work or from taking part in fraudulent peer review if they can't at least provide some kind of evidence. And if they can, then they can go ahead and they can submit their work and participate as normal. And if they are verified but still go on to commit fraud, then like a speeding driver, there's accountability. And this is the feedback loop in the final part of the boxes in the framework. So let's have a really quick look at how it could actually work. This is a kind of visual mock-up. It's just an invention. We're doing some actual genuine UX research on the potential real user journeys. So bear in mind that this is just a mock-up. So somebody might arrive at a journal, in this case, the Journal of Identity Prototyping, and they choose to sign in. Let's say they use their personal email address because that's convenient, and we're not saying that that's not allowed, it's just that it's not enough for trust. So next, there would need to be some kind of choice. How do you want to verify yourself? Let's say they choose to use federated identity. So they go to the WAIF screen, the where are you from screen, as they would today in an access user journey, or if they're signing into another website like ORCID, using this route. So they put in the name of their institution and they're sent off to their institution to sign in, and their institution would send back proof of their individual identity and their institution affiliation, because there's a trust relationship between the system and the institution. That information is trustable. So they then return and they're verified and they can keep going. So this is reasonably fast. Although there's a few screens there, this is the kind of thing that's not going to be massively difficult. It could be even faster though if the user just signed in directly with their institution, or they signed in with ORCID with trust markers, or they use their institutional email from the very start. So we don't have to have multiple steps here. We could combine verification and signing in the same step. In cases where the person doesn't have an institution to lean on, or even an ORCID record, they could use, as I said, third-party document verification systems, as they would with lots of other platforms in the modern world. They'd only need to do this once, remember, because they could then do it much faster next time. I'll make a quick additional point, which could go down a rabbit hole, but I will stop it immediately. And that is to say that this is where digital wallets come in. This is exactly the kind of use case for them where you can carry, as a user, you carry around verified information about yourself and use it in secure and private ways. I think we're going to be doing some more work on this, but I thought I'd just mention them here because that's the direction that all of this kind of stuff is headed in. So the report that we've produced about this framework discusses all of these things and has a set of recommendations. I'm just going to call out the main ones. You won't be surprised that the most important one is to introduce verification, to stop relying on unverifiable identities. Obviously, this is in the context of everything that I've talked about so far, the assessment and the proportionality and the privacy and so on. So that's the first one. The next one is to use ORCID trust markers. As many of you will know, this is where a trusted external entity verifies the claims that are made in an ORCID record rather than them being purely self-claimed. And the more publishers and funders and academic institutions add trust markers into the system, the more powerful and useful this becomes. And although this is an ORCID presentation, I think I should say ORCID themselves would probably be the first to say that this isn't about ORCID. If there are equivalent open systems that operate in the same way and that can come up with ways for trusted signals to be interoperable, then all the better. The final recommendation I want to mention is a broader one, and this is about working together to make this a collaborative effort rather than a closed one. This is a bit like science, right? Where we share our ideas and build on them. There's plenty of work to be done here, and it's only going to be done if we do this in an open way and compare notes on how this actually works and doesn't work, and iterating in that way. So I want to talk about finally, I want to talk about some of the challenges here, and there are plenty. I did say at the beginning that this isn't a silver bullet, and you know, like most things in life, there are trade-offs that we have to work hard to understand and balance. We've got to do the research into how to make sure that the principles that I mentioned earlier are designed in from the start. So how do we calibrate trust? How much trust is enough for these different types of activity? How do we react to the fact that trust might change over time? One of the crucial ones, how do we make sure that people aren't excluded because they don't have access to particular verification methods? And so on. How do we make sure that this can actually be implemented in the real world? So plenty of questions, right? And this is why our current and future work involves testing our assumptions and working to understand these things more and trying to work them out in the real world. We need to be able to show that these ideas stand up and change course if they don't. So we're doing some real world user testing. We're trying some proof of concepts to take the kinds of trust information that we might get and work out how do we calibrate decisions, looking into all of these different things. And the additional verification methods I mentioned, like how could vouching work and so on. These are all questions. But to conclude, I think I just want to say that this is not about barriers or gateways or surveillance or identity for the sake of it. I hope I've been able to explain that this is about building a system where communication, which is the foundation of research, can be trusted. And verified identity is central to this, but it has to be done right. And it can only be done right if we communicate about it. And so I hope that you will provide feedback and that we can have a conversation about it. So thank you. That's me.
Thanks, Richard. Wonderful presentation, very helpful and insightful. We do already have some questions in the Q&A, but I want to give everybody a few minutes to consider what questions they may have and drop them in the Q&A box. We also received quite a few questions during registration, so we'll have a combination of those to answer. I do want to bring everyone's attention to the chat where we've shared some helpful links, including a link to the Researcher Identity Verification Framework draft report. So definitely take those links and save them later to check out. So there's a lot of questions. We have a good mix of researchers and others from around the scholarly ecosystem joining us today. And it seems that there is some concern among researchers about how they can ensure that they are presenting themselves as, having integrity and how to protect themselves from fraudulent activity. So one of our first questions is, are there steps researchers or institutions can take to protect themselves from fraudulent activity, such as false authorship claims or fake citations?
I mean, I guess one answer to that would be to use things like ORCID and it sounds like an advert for ORCID, but I'm saying it in an objective way, hopefully, using systems like ORCID and encouraging the use of trust markers so that you can make claims about yourself which can stand up. Using systems like that are going to put you in a good position for being able to make quick and easy statements about yourself that can be trusted. I think that's the first thing that springs to mind. Hilke, anyone else? Chris, if you want to say anything else.
Yeah, I could add a few thoughts. It's a great question and not an easy one to answer, because I do think indeed there is so there were sort of systemic vulnerabilities that would make it relatively easy for somebody to make statements about somebody else with that being validated, and you could be on the receiving end of that. So some of the things that you said, Richard, I think will help you sort of protect against that. I suppose the other sort of logical thing to do is regularly look for references to your work and to your name and make sure that you're happy with that. And if you're not, then if it's part of the scientific debate, then write an article about that to refute the thing that you're not happy with. And if it's really a case, of somebody acting without integrity, then flag that with the relevant publisher or other authority.
Great, thank you. And then a question that we did receive that is related, and I think Chris would be able to help us answer this one, is there a simple checklist for ORCID record holders to check that their record is as fully certified as being full of integrity as possible?
Richard Hill, could you want me to have a first go at that one?
Sure.
Sure. So I think actually Richard pointed this out, is that we don't know yet which signals of trust are going to be the most important in weeding out integrity. And that's why experimentation and analysis and looking at the data is so important. What we would say, I think, at ORCID, and I'm sure Hilke and Richard can give their perspective afterwards, is more data is better for trust. The more points of correlation there are in an ORCID record, the better there are. And the more different parties that have asserted data in your record, the better. So asserting data yourself is always going to be an option for ORCID, because there are always things that only you know about or are not available in another system that can be linked in. But if you have, for example, your affiliation asserted by your university or your institution, you have a number of works that have been asserted by different publishers, you have funding awards that have been asserted by your research funders, then those different points of verification really hard to fake, particularly if they occur over a reasonable period of time. So to summarize, more data is better, and more parties asserting that data is better from a trust point of view, I think is what we would say. Hilke, Richard, anything to add on that one?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Chris. Maybe just a few things that you already said that seem worth underlining. We're not in a phase, and I wonder if we ever get to a phase that you can say there is like full certification for integrity, right? It's not a binary thing, and we're still figuring out what are the most important traits and the most important things to look for. I think that is important to recognize. And the other thing, just to echo what you said, Chris, which also is, I think you see that reflected in the framework that Richard spoke about today, is really that recognition of the multitude of signals and data points and sources of authority, right? There's not a singular signal that will indicate this individual acted with integrity and that individual maybe not. But if you combine a lot of data sources and that variety of data sources, I do think that really helps to paint a picture and give more credibility to somebody's intentions and their integrity.
One little thing that I might add is so at the moment, before we so none of this stuff exists in the real world yet. None of the identity verification framework that we're talking about exists in the real world yet. But modeling it and prototyping it and piloting it, we're going to have to start from an idea of like somebody with zero trust markers or zero ability to prove anything that's the default, and that somebody who's acting dishonestly is very unlikely to even be able to have one trust marker. That's the starting point, right? If you can add multiple signals, then that gets even better and even stronger. But I think it's likely that somebody who's acting fraudulently is going to find it quite hard to just create an ORCID and get some trust markers into it, because they'd have to be getting those trust markers from somewhere. So the difference between 0 and 1 trust markers is alone quite a big signal. So from there you can build more, but I think that's a big first step.
Definitely. Well, thank you all for your answers. Another question, well, someone's actually provided some feedback and then ties in a question at the end. So their feedback is, to use a metaphor, just like credit history, we need to build a trust history for authors. So perhaps build a list of trust indicators and get authors to provide information against them. And then their question is, what are the trust indicators for publishers?
Who wants to tackle that one?
Also there, I think this is still a field where we are learning and evolving. I think there are definitely some sort of green flags that most people will recognize. Things like having the right procedures in place and be transparent about those procedures, how to uphold integrity. Think about things like procedures to correct or retract articles if that is needed. Be open and transparent about the way that publications are assessed and vetted before they are published. Those kind of indicators, I think, are definitely in the bucket of green checks, if you like. But also here, I think this is still an ongoing conversation to see what exactly are the things you should look for and what are the things to look out for. We all know there are also predatory publishers. So they have quite different characteristics, but yeah, still learning how to exactly pinpoint that, I would say.
Yeah. And maybe if I can give an ORCID perspective on that. Trust markers can only be asserted by our organizational members. Now, we don't vet members to figure out who those predatory publishers are. I think that's will be quite difficult for us to do as an infrastructure organization. But we do have in our legal agreements, in our membership agreement, terms that require our members only to add accurate and true and correct information to ORCID records, and to take steps to correct any information they find out is erroneous. And we have the legal ability to enforce those terms. So that's the mechanism by which we kind of enforce, not just for publishers, but for all of our member organizations. We enforce the integrity of the data added by our members.
And maybe just to add, there was a suggestion by somebody in the chat, which I think is worth reiterating here. There is a sort of toolkit check that is probably worth taking a look at called Think, Check, Submit. We can put the link in the chat. Thank you for suggesting that. That's worthwhile calling out. It's sort of a toolkit to help assess the validity of the publisher before submitting your work.
Yes, and that link is now in the chat for everyone. So thank you for sharing that. So kind of coming back to the community aspect of addressing research integrity, and we have just spoke about publishers. How does the researcher identity trust framework support identity verification across different parts of the research ecosystem? And what role can organizations play in supporting its implementation?
Do you want to take a stab at that first, Richard? That sounds like a Richard question to me.
Sure. I mean, we're at a very early stage here, and we're talking about inviting collaboration from all the different types of all the different parts of the ecosystem. So I think it's all up for grabs about how verification will be implemented in each of the different parts of the academic landscape. I'm trying to work out. Someone rescue me from this question while I think about it a bit more.
Well, I could add two practical suggestions, I think, for research institutes to maybe consider. Also, connecting it to the recommendations in the report that we published. Of course, research organizations can also submit trust markers. I think that is one thing that they could contribute to bolstering integrity and helping people verify their identity and their credentials. Another aspect that you also spoke about in the presentation, Richard, is about ascertaining the digital identity of somebody. How do we verify that somebody is who they claim to be in a digital environment? And their research institutes can also help by implementing technologies such as federated authentication, which provide a pretty robust way to be able to assess that somebody is who they claim to be, or at least that they are with that institute and they are recognized as being an individual working at that institute in a very secure, privacy-preserving way. There are other solutions of doing that as well, but I think federated authentication is probably one of those standards that really hit that sweet spot in reliability, security, privacy-preserving, and being very effective. So that's also something that I think institutes could be looking at if that is not something available at your institutes today.
I might just add something there on. So federated identity isn't it's a big bucket of different ideas. Even if an institution is using federated identity, it might not be releasing certain bits of information about a user that would allow that person to be trusted. So in some cases, somebody who is an alum, the university that I used to go to, however many decades ago, still allows me to sign in with its federated identity infrastructure, as it's an alumnus, being part of the alumni of that university. But that doesn't mean I'm a trusted researcher. And there are particular attributes that can be released by institutions that will be able to differentiate between me as an ex-student from the 1990s and somebody who's a current active member of the research community there. So there are all kinds of nuances within the subject of federated identity that can help to improve the whole story, as well as doing things like making sure that the security around the accounts that people are allowed to use is well looked after, and that if somebody isn't a member of staff anymore or shouldn't be able to sign in anymore, they don't just continue to exist in the system, and that those credentials get lost or sold or borrowed, and then they disappear and the whole thing starts to break down. So yeah, there's a long story there as well.
Great, thank you. And then coming off of that, do you have any suggestions or practical steps that you could advise smaller publishers or institutions with limited resources that they could take to start aligning with the proposed framework, or even adopting research integrity best practices?
I think that's a really, really good question. I mean, one thing I would say is that we're trying to think about this from the beginning as something that isn't only possible to implement if you are a big publisher, right? It's going to be something. It's got to be something that that can be. I don't, whether this involves creating some kind of mechanism or some kind of shared infrastructure. These are totally open questions. There might be a way to create something that can be shared and that others can use, rather than everybody having to build their same verification system themselves. In fact, that would be a bit crazy, I think. So there's Hilke wants to come in.
And also, in addition to perhaps the potential to develop new central services or pieces of infrastructure, there is a lot of existing infrastructure that can be used and can be leveraged. So especially, I think, for parties with more limited resources, probably the low-hanging fruit opportunity is to look at existing integrations that you have with infrastructures in scholarly communications, like ORCID or like DataCite, Crossref, and see if they can be extended to also implement some of the recommendations that we are putting forward. For example, contributing trust markers is basically a way of, it can be done relatively easily by system integration, which, all being well, should be a relatively low effort to make that happen. Is that a fair statement, Chris, or am I oversimplifying as I sometimes do?
No, I think that's true, and I think that it's, there are vendors are key here as well, right? There are only so many vendors of submission systems. A lot of them, I just got back from the SSP conference last week, are busy plugging in a lot of the new innovative research integrity tools into frameworks. And I think most small publishers are making use of those tools, including open source tools like OJS. So I think it is, as is often the case in our world, it is incumbent upon the vendors and the platform providers to make sure these capabilities are available to everybody.
And I think this is always going to be an evolving landscape. It's a bit like, if it was the case that there were cars driving around with no license plates, then the first question would be, oh, well, how do we make sure that I get a license plate on my car? But once everyone starts doing it, somebody will go, okay, well, here's a way to do it that's easier. And you'll just get a license plate when you buy your car. And what I'm saying is that metaphor begins to break down quite quickly. But what I'm saying is, once these things become ideas that people recognize and we can explain, then lots of other things start to change as well. And hopefully it's not going to need to be implemented given everything that's true today. other things will change as well as we move forward.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. Kind of just looking back on the whole presentation, could you fill us in and highlight a bit about what makes this framework different from past or other approaches that have been taken?
I can offer my thoughts while you collect yours, Richard. I think it's really the comprehensiveness and sort of the very structured way that we thought through the problem space. And that's also how we arrived at that framework approach, right? We are not imagining or pretending that it would seem naive to think that there is sort of a simple solution that solves everything. If you really want to do justice to some of the principles that Richard highlighted, like inclusivity, proportionality, efficiency, user privacy, etc., you sort of logically arrive at that notion of a framework that offers different routes for verification, some of which are interchangeable, others are not. They operate on different dimensions. And at least I am not aware of previous work that really put together that standard or that structured the problem in such a deliberate and well thought through way. Would be my first answer.
I think that's kind of what my brain was trying to form some sentences around. I think it's about trying to step back and work out what you're trying to actually do and why, rather than just jumping to immediately put some kind of solution in place. Because that, if you just put a solution in place, for example, if you were to say, we're banning all Gmail and Yahoo addresses on all editorial systems, you can no longer register unless it's with an institutional email address, for example. If that was a suggestion, and I've seen people saying that, or people have asked, should we just do that? And that kind of jumps straight to a solution. But as you've heard from what I was saying, that potentially excludes all those people who are independent researchers or people who come from universities in parts of the world where you don't have institutional email addresses. That's not how it works. So I think this framework is trying to take a step back and work out what the question is before saying what the answer is, if you see what I mean.
While, let me add that, while also connecting to a lot of pre-existing work, right? This is not trying to reinvent the wheel or reimagining everything from scratch. There's a lot of existing infrastructure solutions, frameworks out there that we connect with and that also have a place in the framework that we are putting forward, like ORCID.
Great. Well, that is all our time. Chris, do you have any final thoughts for our audience?
Just to say thank you very much to not just Richard and Hilke, but the whole group that are involved in putting this framework together. I think it is the first time that I've seen this kind of systematic approach to thinking about these different dimensions of identity in research and scholarship. I don't think it's proposed to be a solution in its own right. It's more a way of thinking about the problem and thinking about solutions. So congrats to the team. I encourage you all to read the report if you haven't done. It's not that long. Yeah, I think it's going to be helpful in us all figuring out how to take these solutions forward and fixing the integrity crisis in scholarly publishing. So thanks very much for participating, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
See you next time.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.